In this cinematography breakdown, I'm looking at the new Netflix adaptation, Reacher, and I'm specifically focusing on the day exterior scenes just here. There are a few things that I think will be interesting to look at, and in the context of a more TV series kind of format, you don't have all the time in the world to spend on getting your scenes, and that sometimes means that you have to take what you're given in terms of the lighting and how it changes. But even in films, people will have to work with what the time constraints, the budget constraints, and the weather are giving them. So it's an interesting little case study just here. Diving in, we see that our characters are coming out of the police station, and we're getting lots of soft light just here. So I'm going to pull up the pen. Push of light is coming from this direction just here. Downside, not much of it, but it's in that rough direction. But because they are kind of proceeding out from the shadow of the building, all of the push is coming flatter onto them than it would otherwise be. Also, you can see these little pops on the police car just in the back there. So it is actually looking like it's shot at a pretty bright time of day. Jumping onto the next shot, we can see that hard push of sun coming in. It is pretty bright on him, catching all over his shoulders, around there. So we know that the sun can't be low in the sky because it's catching all the way around him from behind that building, and everything that's falling on his face is actually looking relatively soft within that. So we're not getting too much hard light wrapping around at all. This is all in shadow just there, and the whole side of the building is also in shadow. Interesting, if you look down here, you can actually see the shadow of the other actor as well. So we have the two shadows in there, which, I don't know, it kind of tells you that when they're shooting this, they are making sure that there's some eye line for the actors, and even if sometimes, perhaps, you could shoot that and you don't need to have the other actor in, it actually helps for the eye line, and it helps for the performance to be able to put someone in there, even if it isn't the other talent. Now, we've got a couple of other things here that are of note. He's actually reflected in the window just there. If you've ever been out on location where you have windows behind you or anything reflected, these are actually pretty mirrored in the scheme of things. You're going to have to consider where the crew stands, where you're putting crafty, where you're actually going to be positioning any bounce or neg, because it can all reflect in, obviously, that reflective surface. Now, sometimes it isn't going to be practical to stage something in a way which would avoid those reflections. So you may find that you actually do some kind of replacement in post, or perhaps you're angling the glass or the reflective surface. If it's a mirror, you might just be angling it to look a little bit off to the side, so you're not catching yourselves in it. Now, glasses is something we're going to get to in a moment, and that actually is much harder to fake, and we'll see some little telltale signs within those. Flip off to the reverse shot just here, and everything is pretty consistent. Sun is coming in this way. We have it on Jack's back, and that would make sense. Doesn't look like it's at a massively different time of day, and it feels hot. You've got that kind of hazy look to the sky up there. It's not bright blue. It's got a sort of yellowy greeny quality to it. It just feels like a hot, hazy day. Nice little bits of sort of set dressing in the background and stuff. I guess that was just there. I don't think they went to the effort of putting those in, but it does reinforce that kind of late summer kind of vibe that we've got going on just here. Nothing much to say. Going to dive onto the next frame. It's interesting for me looking at this close-up just here, because a lot of the time in the commercial space that we tend to work in, we want people to look good. The cinematography tends towards making things beautiful in terms of lighting, in terms of staging, in terms of all of the things that you're doing to sell a product normally. That doesn't often leave us the space to create something where there's a character who's not in the most flattering light. It isn't generally something that you will stumble upon in the commercial space, unless you have a little bit more license and you're trying to evoke some kind of vibe for a character who's meant to be evil. Now here, this is what the day is giving them, and it is pretty accurate to like a day exterior. You will get all of these super hard shadows around his glasses just here, just kicking down across his nose, and as he moves, those shadows are moving. It's kind of distracting. It isn't the nicest look you can go for, and I appreciate that everything I've just said, that isn't necessarily always the consideration, and that isn't always what good cinematography is about. We don't have to always get something that looks beautiful in order to tell the narrative, and sometimes the narrative means that you don't want things to look beautiful. Now, at the moment that we see this character, I don't think there's any particular spoilers here, he isn't being portrayed as necessarily a good guy, or necessarily a completely bad guy, but his persona perhaps would be one which we didn't want to complement too much with soft lighting. We might want to keep it a little bit more ambiguous, give him some hard light, and make him feel like he's sitting on the fence. We're not quite sure whether he's good or bad yet. So when we look at this frame, if I was trying to make all those arguments, I could say that that is definitely a reason why you might do this. Another reason is we are shooting and we're trying to shoot quickly, and we're accepting the fact that people who wear glasses will have shadows cast across their face. Within the rest of everything that we've seen just there, we are getting shadow on the left-hand side, so he's got a downside just here, and we can see the shadow of his head on his shoulder. So the sun doesn't really look like it's changed too much from the initial establishing shots just there. Seems pretty consistent. Jumping onto the next frame, we see a wide which just sets the scene of where they're standing, and everything tallies here. Now, I would say that potentially in this wide, the sun isn't quite in the same place, but it's not far off. And in the context of something like this, I'd say that that's a pretty good analogy of where the sun would have been for the close-up that we just saw. We can see that it is casting in this direction, sort of from behind them a little bit, but all over Jack's back just there, and across our detective just here. The shadows aren't too pronounced, and in the wide shot you can get away with all that just fine. It's more in the close-ups you'll find that you'll come into finesse. It's interesting looking at the clouds in the background just here, and we got a little bit of blue sky, but it isn't super blue. We still got that more muted, subdued, yellowy, greeny patina to it. Jack proceeds to move over to this side of the frame, and that changes everything around, because now Jack should be getting all of that hard light that we talked about a moment ago with the detective. But when we jump into the close-ups, we're going to see it's not quite how you'd imagine. So everything is consistent here, but when we get into the close-up shots, we see that he's actually got the light a little bit further around perhaps than Jack did, I would say. So the shadows perhaps are coming around a little bit more this way, whereas with Jack, I'd say that it was a little bit more like the sun was almost directly behind him. This has definitely got a little bit more directionality to it, I would say. We've got a massive hot spot across his head, and we are seeing little shadows from his hair. Just there, he's got quite short hair, but the sun's shining through it. And again, goes back to the glasses. It's not a completely flattering thing. We can see actually little reflections coming in from his glasses, just kicking out the light. We've got shadow just here. We've got a really bright hotspot triangle just by his nose. So he's still not getting the most complementary light, even though he should be backlit now. It's kind of harsh on his head, a little bit top lighty. It's not making him look as good as perhaps he could do. When we flick over to Jack, all of a sudden, something else is going on now. This should be almost exactly the same as what we saw on the detective when he was in this same position, facing the same direction, but it's not quite the same. The push of light is from roughly the same direction, but it's wrapping around. So we have light all across Jack's face, just down, all the way there. The shadow side is down here, but all of this area that's in shadow, you can see that it's actually much more front lit than we were when we were in this shot before. So he's getting a more frontal look. He's also seeming like the shadows aren't as harsh as they would have been. So for me, that probably means that we've got some sort of diffusion frame going on here. I'd say it's a very light diffusion. It's not like super heavy. The shadows are still pronounced, they're still there. But I would say that this diffusion frame is taking the direct sunlight and it's just giving it a little bit of softening, spreading it out a little bit more, wrapping it around a little bit more. It may be that we have a frontal sort of bounce, just kicking something back in. I don't think it's too much, but the side of his face that's down isn't mega down. So it does feel like there's perhaps another frame. If I was doing this, I probably would be trying not to take the frame all the way over to this side, because then that's going to sort of really squash in between the sunlight coming in and a bounce coming in. It will look very filly. But I would say just bringing in a little bit of frontal fill just there, something which is sort of off here. So we're extending it around. He's not getting a ton in his eyes. I mean, his eyes are almost closed. He's got a whole kind of Clint Eastwood vibe going on here. But you can see a little bit of something in there. Maybe there's a little peak just in his eye there of a bounce. If I was doing the scene, that's probably how I'd approach it. Lighter silk on this side, some kind of gentle bounce pushing in. Doesn't look like there's a really dense negative, so for me that all tallies up. Cutting back, we can see this really super harsh sunlight now on him. It's definitely feeling like we're getting all those hot spots and shadow the building just around there. It does still all tally, and if we just analyze a little bit of what's going on just here, we'll see that they've done a very good job of hiding anything that might be there. We can see a reflection of Jack just there. So they're doing a good job of keeping themselves out of any of these reflections. This is the frame where we start to see some of the fakery. So when we look at Jack's face just here, we can see he's getting much harder lines, much harder light than he did in the previous scene. It is still analogous to what we saw, so the positioning is still kind of the same. We still have light coming in from this side, that's all good. We still have the shadow kind of cutting around like this, so it's the same kind of shape that we had in his face, but it seems much harder, and you can really tell when you look at this little hot spot on his head, that's a specular highlight, that's really catching the sweat. So it's not as beautiful as the close-ups, but everything stays consistent in terms of lighting direction and the general vibe. And of course, we see this all the time when we're doing close-ups. We do take those liberties to make sure that we're able to get the shots we need, and you can't very easily on a show like this be able to stage in the kind of diffusion and lights and neg and bounce that you would need to be able to do this as a wide shot. It would just be crazy. And we can see his shadow here is definitely slightly elongated from some of the other shadows that we have seen. So they are moving through the day as we're doing this for sure. And then just one last time on this, we are seeing now compared, that is so much softer. Gentle fall off wrapping around this way is there for all to see. When you're doing this, it does show that you can get away with an awful lot, and you don't have to worry too much between wides and close-ups if you are maintaining 100% consistency with your shadow density and with the hardness of your lighting and therefore the definition of those shadows. So when you go out and you shoot things, just think how you're going to schedule it. That's really the critical factor just here. Knowing how you can schedule it to your advantage, knowing where your character is going to be positioned so that you can more easily manipulate the light, because you don't want to be in a position where you're dealing with completely toppy light, for example, trying to diffuse it. If you're then going to cut to the wide shots and show really sidey light coming in with long shadows, it'll make it much harder to sell that scene. If you do it the other way, then it's a little bit easier to wrap the light around and feel like things are a little bit more frontal or toppy than it is to make it feel completely directional. As with anything, the key here is experimentation. It isn't too difficult to go out and just try this with a few people. If you've got one person who can stand there whilst you just position them relative to the sunlight, see what moving them around does to the shape on their face, and see what you can do with a simple bounce even. Getting into diffusion, I think, is a little bit harder because the diffusion needs to be often held up higher and held in position in an awkward fashion if you've just got people. And if you're using stands, that's a lot more grip that you're going to need to be able to do that. You've got to have big stands, you've got to have sandbags, you've got to have people standing on them to make sure that they're not going to blow over or anything, get people hurt. So when you are working with this, a little bounce is easier to wrangle than diffusion, I think. And also, I would say the same goes for neg. You'll have to use an awful lot of neg to take the sky out. And that means a big frame, it means lots of sandbags, it means anchoring it down. All of those kind of things are hard to do on a budget. But if you have a little circular bounce, a little bit of foam core, and you can get someone to hold it in position, you'll be able to get a much cleaner frame. And when you're looking at things that have the sky in shot, that's a real consideration because the sky has a certain level to it. And if the people are being backlit or they're being side lit, you might find that that bounce actually helps you to balance out the background, balance out the sky, and just make your frame feel much better in terms of exposure. Once you've got over the exposure, then you can start to look at how you can actually make things look a certain way, make someone look a little bit more defined, make them have a little bit more light in their eyes, or maybe you want to be able to keep it consistent over the course of an hour or two. So then you start to look at how those levels work when you're dealing with a longer shoot, when you're dealing with dialogue, and how you can make that consistent. In general, you're going to be getting your wide shot to establish what the lighting is, and then in your mediums or your close-ups, you have a little bit more liberty to play around. But the wide shots, they're almost unattainably difficult to do in a controlled fashion on a budget. But as this shows, the wide shots really are just about getting to your location at the right time, making sure that you have things set up, you're facing the right direction, and then you're able to work around that to schedule your other shots. So really just to highlight that difference between this medium wide 2-shot where you've got a much more defined shadow on Jack and the close-up shot, just taking a look at what's going on just here. All the shadowing, we can even see like his eyebrows are playing as shadows just there. You're getting that kind of slightly fuzzy outline. Compared to this, where the light is just wrapping around, we can see a little bit of a catch in his eyes just there. It's definitely softened. It's definitely got a bit of frontal push to it. It's a much more flattering shot in terms of lighting. You can make all kinds of arguments in terms of the significance of showing a character with a flattering light versus a really harsh light. But it's certainly interesting from a cinematographer's point of view to look at this and say, okay, this is the medium wide, this I'm playing as a close-up, and we saw what we were doing with the wide shots previously as well. We have to make it all knit together a little bit, but at the same time, I want to be able to have a little bit of something in my character's face, and I don't want the close-ups to feel like that where we are getting the harder lines and the harder light all the time. So you have liberties that you can take at every single step. Next up, we've got a scene which plays very, very differently. This is shot on a mostly cloudy day, and you can see this really does look overcast, no blue in the sky. We'll play through a long shot where he walks past a police car. Good excuse to have action playing in the foreground. So we see him walking through, and then you see little snippets of things happening, and he's obviously passing behind it, so that helps to give it a sense of urgency. And then we get into this framing just here. We can see it's a really, really soft down kind of day. There is a push of light coming from the far side, I would say. If anything, it feels like the sun is over this side and it is giving something, but not much at all. It is behind cloud cover. We're probably looking at a little bit of bounce light coming in just here. I'd say that these two perhaps are getting a little bit of extra fill, especially because she's got the hat on. I would expect that underneath just here, she would be in a little bit more shadow, but that's getting filled in a bit. So yeah, sure, we fill in a little bit, make it a little bit easier to see her face, see her eyes, let her emote. Cutting into this shot, we're seeing much more light playing on tops of heads and shoulders. So things obviously change a little bit in between these two scenes when they've been shooting, but apart from that, there's not too much to comment on. Cut back to that reverse, everything's soft, nothing much happening, cloudy day, and when he gets to there, it is gone back to being cloudy day, and we see the scene play out. It's really fascinating when I'm looking at these, comparing them to the previous shots and the levels on people's faces and the way that people are playing, and it makes you appreciate how the consistency that you're getting within a TV series is really down to what's happening on the day. There isn't that fine control and ability to always play your characters in the kind of light that you would like. And this can be a conscious decision to go for something which just plays the way that it feels on the day versus trying to control things too much. Again, I would call out her hat. She is getting a little bit of shadow under the peak, but not nearly as much as I would expect. So I would suggest that there's some bounce coming in from camera side just here. Probably quite frontal, I'd say. I don't think it's got much directionality to it. So just a little bit of bounce for them so that they get more in their faces and we're not feeling that push from the sunlight being this direction. You can see on his head too much. Just going to look at this sequence now outside the coroner's office. Hard sunlight again coming in. So we have this all directional coming onto the back just there. Shadow side, not super down, so maybe there's some bounce in there, but we are getting hot spots playing across all of their faces and the sides just there. Comparing that then to what happens in this shot, fascinating. The sun has come around. It is much higher when we're looking at it in this shot just here. So comparing it to the shadows that we're seeing just here, admittedly the characters do turn a little bit, but not that much, and the shadow line from his head is completely blending down into the shadow on his shoulder just here. So it's quite a long shadow. The sun is quite low in this shot. If we then compare to this shot, we see that the shadow line is completely different. We have a well-defined shadow, but it is ending just kind of around his clavicle area just here. We can also see another little tell, and that is his hair. We're getting shadows from his hair cast across his forehead just there, and his hair's coming out like this. So the sun clearly, we can kind of see it from the light that I've got up there, but it's super soft. It's playing much more like midday than it was in the previous shot, and it's also been softened quite considerably. So the push of light that we're getting, because if we're saying it's top here, we're going to have to wrap it down a little bit and make it a little bit softer on the skin. We're having, say, a diffusion frame. Not super heavy. When I'm talking about diffusion for this kind of stuff, I'm not talking about your 1 stops, your 2 stops. This is maybe half a stop. I'd say probably less. I'd say if I was going for this, I'd be using quite a fine silk, just something that will help to blend it into some of the bounce that I'm doing, but not take away from that directionality. So we still want it to feel like it is a bright sunny day. We don't want to take him so far down, reduce the level so much that he feels like he's under the shadow of a tree. I'd want it to feel a little bit softer in the close-ups, still have that directionality, but also then give me the control and the interest in the face to not completely obscure everything with really hard shadows. And if this was super direct, no diffusion, no bounce, you would probably find that these lines around his eyes were just a bit ugly and hard to see what's happening in his eye sockets. He's got a relatively pronounced brow, and that's going to hide his eyes a bit because he's always got his eyes quite closed. We do need a little bit in there to get some emoting happening with the character. Shadow all down side of his face. We're getting shadow from glasses just here, shadow from his ear. So we do see that it is much toppier if it's managing. He's got his head on the side, but it's managing to get onto the side of his head just there. In the previous shot, there's no way that it would be doing that. It'd just be really sidey coming in. Going back into a wide, we see this sort of tallies with everything that we've just said. The sun is coming from this direction. We're getting shadows on the floor for each of them and for the cars. It fits with what we've been talking about, but we can clearly see the entire side in shadow just there. Jumping over to this shot, earlier I mentioned the lensing that they're using on this, and it's something which I'm trying to dig around and find out more about, but the lens has a very particular characteristic, and I assume that it's the lens and not any filtration that they're using, although it would be possible to have some of this with filtration. It's a very streaky looking out of focus bokeh that they've got going on, so it feels like it's got a sort of vertical vibe to it, and we see it on shots like this where we are quite close and we have a big out of focus area in the background. All of the trees are kind of smeary. When we get into the night shots, we'll see another take on this with the headlights and the way that things streak and bloom and flare. It's an interesting characteristic that they got going on with this. You are getting a little bit of that in this shot also. You can see kind of that streaky, almost like the vintage Lomo lenses where they have that sort of slightly warped, stretched circular bokeh. Really, really interesting vibe for that. And also, I'm going to call it out, the shadows on our detective's face just here are super hard compared to what we had on Jack a moment ago. So he's getting a much, much harder light, and we can see even the shadows of individual hairs playing on his head just there. Where Jack did have the shadows of his hair, it just felt like the ratio between the highlight that was hitting and casting that shadow and the shadow itself was much lower. Here the contrast ratio feels like it's much higher between those two. So interesting just to call out as we see it. Immediately jumping between those two shots, admittedly, they're in a different position. Jack's going to be getting the light in a different way. But the way that the light looks on his face just there compared to this, where we have a softer, more frontal vibe, and everything just feels like it's been toned down a little bit. In the wide shot, I would say that Jack is getting the same kind of light that he's getting. So we see a super pronounced highlight all down the side just there. If we cut into that, I think that it would feel a little bit more hard, a little bit more direct than we're getting in the close-ups where they've finessed everything. I might be going crazy, but it feels like she is getting a much softer light now. All of this area is illuminated, but it's not hard. She is looking up, you know, she's quite close to him. She's looking up and she's shorter. So maybe that's the reason. But to me, it feels like the ratio between shadow and fill just here and the way that the light is wrapping around, she's been diffused. She's got a bit more fill light coming in. I would say that probably even a bounce in there just to give a little bit of return to her. And then on this side, I think something diffusing so that everything that's falling on her just there, that's a horrible drawing, is feeling much softer. That would go to character a little bit as well, because at this point she's being the calm voice of reason. She's trying to quell everyone's anger a little bit, so she's getting that softer light, and it's feeling like she's a little bit more angelic and reasonable than perhaps either of those other two have been. Looking here at the town centre, we're just coming out of the town hall. We can see that it's an overcast day, so one would expect everything to feel really soft, and it does. Got a bit of push of light coming from the right hand side of frame just here. That is lighting everyone. It's a long shot that this plays out in, so I don't think they're particularly doing anything. You might find someone's walking with a bounce or something like that, but nothing big's going to be going on during this scene. As they progress through the scene, we get a slightly more sunlit look, more directional, more in line with the things that we've been talking about. Jack definitely is getting a harder light just here. We're seeing a little bit more pronounced shadowing under his nose and jaw just there. So all of this is feeling a little bit more like it's direct sunlight and it's just coming through a little bit of cloud, and that's where the diffusion's coming in from. But the ratio between the two sides isn't huge. It's not like we've got a massive downside. And I have to say, actually, outside of the night scenes, I haven't noticed the day scenes trying to give a really dense shadow look. I know that a lot of shows will bring in lots of negative and really play the downside hard, but because of the way they're doing this, almost every single scene that they have outside, a character will start off on one side of the frame and they'll just be there and they'll be talking to someone over here, and then partway through the scene they will switch places and the one character will pass the other and then turn around. The way they're playing things out, I think it would be much harder to work in that way where you're getting lots of dense shadows, because it's almost like they're doing it in a very organic way to make things feel a certain way from the directing and from the way the characters are interacting. And having that, we're always standing by the side of a building and we're always having a downside or always under an overhang or a tree, or we're just shaping people off for no reason, it would probably feel less natural in this particular setup and the way that they're staging things. So the blocking does definitely factor into it, I would say. Now we go through that scene, nothing particularly unusual, cutting back and forth between them. And then we get here, we have the mayor who's just been appointed something, no spoilers, and it's gone back to being very down. We have a pretty soft look on both of them, and the people in the background as well, all playing pretty much the same. Doesn't seem like anyone's getting any more of anything. Now, in between the two angles, the sun comes out. And as the sun comes out, we get a really defined hotspot over Jack's shoulders and coming around a little bit down onto his chest even. So that tells you that the sun is in a certain position. It's got to be quite high and it's got to be really kicking in from that sort of direction to play like it does. And you can see in the background there's an element of shadowing around this statue as well, telling you that if the sun was lower, that shadow of the statue would be coming much further, but it's barely extending beyond the plinth. So you know that it's pretty close to midday, and everything tells you that. Top of the head, the way the shadows are falling, the way it's falling down his chest, and also the fact that with this guy, we're getting the light casting all the way over his shoulder just there. So that is pretty accurate for a daylight top lit look. We've got quite a lot on Jack's face, but the sun's pretty bright. I'd say, you know, his fill side there, we are maybe doing a little bit of bouncing in. But when we cut back to the mare, he is completely in shadow. Now, between these two shots, the mare should be getting direct sunlight onto his face. And for whatever reason, the light on the mare's face feels like we've got a live side this side and a down side this side. And that, to me, feels like they're shot at different times and not being manipulated to be like that. So I'd say it's more of a scheduling thing and the weather doing something rather than them actively trying to bring in a big diffusion over this huge area, because of course it's in the background as well to get this look, particularly for the mare. It's a scheduling thing, no doubt about it. They've just had to deal with what they've got. Cut back and we're back into that hard shadow again, hard lines. So all of this comes back in and they just cut back and forth between these two. Remember that, because when you're out and you're trying to schedule things and the weather's not working for you and you're in and out of clouds, remember that as long as you are jumping between shots, you're not going to find that people really notice it. You know, outside of people in the industry, people who know and people who are really looking for it, you see this all the time, especially in TV drama, because the schedule just is not going to allow you the time, the budget to be able to either wait till the next day to shoot it or manipulate it to look the way you want. Back to the soft light for the mare. He is definitely catching more on his left side. Camera left, that is. Then he is on the right side. And then we jump to this shot for Jack, where he is getting completely soft light. The cloud has moved in. He's not getting any defined lighting on his shoulders at all. And even in his eyes, there really isn't all that much. It feels like there's a little bit of bounce coming up. You can kind of maybe see, maybe there's a bounce just there. In fact, I'm pretty sure there is a bounce there. Here we go. Just around his nose, just here, it looks like he's getting more than he would otherwise be getting. So my money would be on a bounce just in here to give him a little bit of something, obviously not right under him like that. You're not clamshell beauty lighting him, but it would be a little push coming back up in, filling his face. And of course, because Jack's quite a big character, we're often shooting him from a position where we look up at him a bit. It helps to reinforce the fact that he's a big, imposing character, but also in terms of staging between two people, if you position yourself at Jack's height all the time, you're going to always be really looking down on other characters. So it's something which they're going to deal with between all of the shots that we're working with here, but we're center framed, we're looking up at him, and I think there's a little bit of return. So in summary for that, I think that the sun's moved in. Obviously, got cloud coming in, he's soft lit, we're just pushing a little bit of level back towards him and calling it a day. So summing all up, I find it really interesting looking at a show over the course of a couple of episodes and seeing how they're dealing with exterior scenes, for example. It's something that I always bump up against when I'm having to shoot a commercial. We have many restraints on what we can do, and if we're doing an exterior, everyone just gets a little bit nervous, especially in the UK. You know, we are renowned for having weather which isn't necessarily complementary to a easy outdoor shoot. We might get cloud, we might get rain, we might get lucky, it might be sunny. And if it is sunny, then we've got to control that, and that's a whole other kettle of fish, and you've got to really know that your crew can deal with that and be able to work quickly to take advantage of that, and you're not going to get caught out by having a bright sunny day which suddenly turns into a really cloudy, dark, rainy day. So exterior scenes particularly fascinate me. We're going to be looking at a couple more scenes. I'm trying to avoid covering the entire series or attempting to cover the entire series. So I'm looking at pockets of related shots, day exteriors, night exteriors, day interiors, night interiors, that kind of thing, where I can look at a few different shots and stick a finger in the wind, say this feels like the kind of direction they're going, because by looking at a couple of them, you get a sense of whether it is a stylistic thing that they are trying to do repeatedly again and again and again, or if it's we just had to shoot it this way because of the limitations of what we had. All of the day scenes, they're going to have copious amounts of light that they can use, either to manipulate it, bounce it, diffuse it, use neg to cut it, whatever it is. In the night interiors, and even the day interiors to some extent, we're going to see differences that creep in, because at that point, you're not dealing with natural light. You've got to be using lighting. The choices that they make are really interesting. If anyone has information about this, I haven't been able to find out much, so I'd be interested. Drop it in the comments below, and I will see you in the next episode.